I sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Blackwell and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in Boston, dressed not in the casual attire of a new mother 6 weeks postpartum, but in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Spread before me on the gleaming table were bank statements, trust documents, and power of attorney forms, all bearing the family name of my husband, Richard Harrington III. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, would be arriving in exactly 17 minutes, expecting a reconciliation lunch where she would explain away how she'd borrowed my savings while I was bringing her grandchild into the world. What she didn't know was that this meeting would change everything about the Harrington family power structure forever. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister, Sophia. "Baby is perfect with Dad. Focus on what you need to do." She just arrived. At the building, wearing pearls and that smug smile. I allowed myself a small moment of grief for the relationship that could have been, running my fingers over the photo of my newborn daughter tucked inside my portfolio. 6 weeks ago, as contractions ripped through my body in the delivery room of Massachusetts General Hospital, I could never have imagined being here, preparing to dismantle the careful facade my mother-in-law had maintained for decades. The law firm's conference room overlooked the Boston Harbor, the water glittering under the October sun. How fitting that Eleanor would lose everything with such a spectacular view. Richard's family wealth had always been a source of both comfort and tension in our 3-year marriage. Old Boston money came with old Boston traditions, expectations, and secrets. I'd married for love, not money. A concept Eleanor had never quite believed despite my successful career as an architectural conservationist specializing in historical properties. Mrs. Harrington, my attorney, Vivian Chang, entered with a quiet confidence that immediately filled the room. "Everything is prepared exactly as requested. The documentation is comprehensive." She placed a slim leather folder in front of me. "Are you certain you want to proceed today? We could delay—" "No more delays," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "I've given Eleanor 6 weeks to come clean, to apologize, to make this right. Instead, she's been meeting with her financial advisor, transferring more assets, and telling the family I'm suffering from postpartum psychosis." I smiled, though there was no humor in it. "Let's see how she explains away the evidence I've compiled." Vivian nodded, her expression professional but with a hint of admiration. Few people stood up to Eleanor Harrington, the widow who had managed to triple her late husband's already substantial fortune through shrewd, and, as I discovered, occasionally unethical, business maneuvers. She had cultivated an image of philanthropic generosity while privately wielding her wealth like a weapon against anyone who threatened her control, especially over her only son. "Richard will be arriving separately?" Vivian asked, organizing her papers. "Yes. He'll be here at precisely noon after Eleanor has had 15 minutes to attempt to manipulate me into silence." I checked my watch. "He's dropping off additional documents from the house safe that she doesn't know he can access." The discovery of what my mother-in-law had done came in stages of escalating betrayal. First, there was the emergency alert from my bank while I was in active labor, unusual activity on my accounts. I'd dismissed it, focusing on bringing our daughter into the world. Then came the congratulatory text from our realtor about finally selling our historic brownstone, a property I'd been renovating for 3 years that wasn't even on the market. By the time I was holding my newborn, my personal savings had been emptied, my business account drained, and the property I'd poured my heart into sold to one of Eleanor's friends for well below market value, all through a series of carefully forged documents and financial maneuvers that exploited the power of attorney I'd granted to Richard, not Eleanor, for emergency medical decisions. What Eleanor never suspected was that Richard's father, before his death, had established an irrevocable trust for his son with one unusual condition: Richard's spouse would become the sole trustee if they had a child together. The old man, having suffered through 40 years of Eleanor's controlling nature, had created a financial escape hatch for his son and future grandchildren without Eleanor's knowledge. 2 years into our marriage, Richard had revealed this to me, but we'd agreed to keep it private, living modestly on our own incomes rather than the substantial trust that would one day fund our children's futures. The intercom buzzed. "Mrs. Eleanor." "Harrington has arrived," announced the receptionist. "Send her in 5 minutes," Vivian instructed, giving me one final moment of preparation. I closed my eyes briefly, centering myself. The past 6 weeks had been a careful chess game, appearing vulnerable and overwhelmed by new motherhood while secretly working with forensic accountants, private investigators, and Richard's childhood nanny who had kept meticulous records of Eleanor's financial manipulations spanning decades. I'd discovered that what she'd done to me was merely the latest in a pattern of financial control and sabotage aimed at anyone she perceived as threatening her relationship with her son. "I still don't understand why she did this," Vivian said, quietly, breaking the silence. "The Harringtons have more money than they could spend in several lifetimes." "It was never about the money," I replied, arranging the evidence folders in the precise order I wanted to reveal them. "It's about control. Eleanor has spent decades ensuring that everyone in Richard's life depends on her financially. My independence threatened that system." I straightened my jacket, feeling the weight of responsibility for what I was about to do. She thought my maternity leave was the perfect opportunity to render me financially dependent, forcing me to turn to her for help. She just didn't expect me to fight back. The door opened, and Eleanor Harrington entered the conference room like she owned it. And given her donations to the firm's annual charity gala, she probably thought she did. At 62, she was elegantly preserved through the best cosmetic procedures money could buy, her silver blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her Chanel suit impeccable. The brief flash of surprise at seeing me dressed for battle, rather than beaten down quickly, transformed into her practiced social smile. "Alexandra, darling." She crossed the room with arms outstretched for an embrace I didn't return. "You're looking well, though I must say I'm confused about this meeting. I thought we were having lunch at Le Ciel to discuss the nursery renovations I'd like to gift you." Vivian Chang stood, extending her hand. "Mrs. Harrington, I'm Vivian Chang, representing Alexandra in this matter." Eleanor's smile faltered momentarily as she assessed the leather portfolios and legal documents spread across the table. "A lawyer? Surely that's not necessary for a family discussion." She turned to me, her voice dropping to a concerned whisper. "Alexandra, is this about the brownstone? I've explained that it was a misunderstanding with the realtor. These pregnancy hormones can make everything seem so much worse than it is." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Please sit down, Eleanor. There's been a change of plans for today." I opened the first folder, revealing bank statements with highlighted transactions. "We're not discussing nursery renovations. We're discussing how you systematically emptied my accounts while I was in labor, sold my property without authorization, and attempted to financially incapacitate me at the most vulnerable moment of my life." Her composure cracked for just an instant before she recovered, smoothing her already smooth skirt as she took her seat. "I see Richard has been filling your head with exaggerations again. Everything I did was to protect this family's interests. If you'd like to discuss this rationally—" "Oh, we're going to discuss it," I replied, my calm voice belying the months of rage and planning that had led to this moment. "In fact, I've prepared quite a comprehensive presentation about your financial activities, not just regarding my accounts, but going back 20 years to when you first began embezzling from Richard's father's company." The slight widening of her eyes told me she hadn't expected this level of investigation. She reached for her purse, likely for her phone to call her personal attorney, but I continued before she could retrieve it. "Your attorney can't join us today, I'm afraid. He's currently meeting with the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI about some irregularities in the Harrington Family Foundation's tax filings. Irregularities that, coincidentally, all seem to benefit accounts in your name. Eleanor's hand froze midway to her purse. For the first time since I'd met her 5 years ago at a charity auction where Richard and I had first connected, I saw genuine fear flicker across her perfectly maintained features. The conference room door opened again, and Richard entered precisely on schedule, carrying a leather briefcase I recognized from his father's study, the one containing the original trust documents that would complete today's revelation. One look at his mother's face, and he knew we had begun. "Mother," he said simply, placing the briefcase on the table and taking the seat beside me. He reached for my hand, squeezing it in solidarity. "I believe Alexandra has something important to share with you about our family's financial future." Eleanor's gaze darted between us, the perfect facade beginning to crack as she realized that her son, the one person she thought would always choose her, was firmly on my side. The power dynamic she had spent decades cultivating was about to be irrevocably reversed. The antique grandfather clock in the corner of the conference room ticked loudly, marking each second of the uncomfortable silence that had fallen after Richard's entrance. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see dark clouds gathering over Boston Harbor, a storm approaching that mirrored the one brewing in this mahogany-paneled room. We had exactly 45 minutes before the Harrington family attorney, Walter Pennington, would arrive, summoned not by Eleanor, but by us, to witness the transfer of control that was about to take place. "Richard, what is the meaning of this?" Eleanor's voice had lost its usual melodic quality, replaced by a sharp edge that revealed her growing concern. "If this is about Alexandra's brownstone, I've already explained that I was simply trying to help while she was indisposed. The market was perfect for selling, and that property was draining her resources." Richard shook his head, his expression uncharacteristically hard when facing his mother. The brownstone that Alexandra spent 3 years restoring? The one that was weeks away from being featured in Architectural Digest? The one that would have established her independent reputation in historical preservation? He opened his briefcase, methodically arranging documents in front of him. "That brownstone?" My phone buzzed with a text from my private investigator, Mateo. "Financial records secured from Cayman account. Confirmation of transfers on delivery days is specified." I showed the message to Vivian, who nodded slightly. Another piece in place. The countdown to Eleanor's complete exposure was proceeding exactly as planned. "I have a board meeting at 3, Eleanor said, glancing at her watch, a vintage Cartier that had belonged to Richard's grandmother. "If we could expedite whatever this theatrical production is about—" "Your board meeting has been postponed," I interrupted, my voice steady. "In fact, the Harrington Foundation board members are gathering in the conference room down the hall at this very moment, reviewing some rather interesting financial disclosures." I slid a document across the table. "They're particularly interested in these transfers that coincide with my hospital admission dates." Eleanor barely glanced at the paper, maintaining her composure with practiced ease. "I've managed the Harrington finances for 30 years. I hardly think a few routine transfers warrant this level of drama." She turned to Richard, her voice softening. "Darling, I understand that new parenthood is stressful, but allowing Alexandra to create these wild conspiracies isn't healthy for anyone, especially for little Evelyn." The mention of my daughter's name from her lips sent a surge of protective rage through me, but I channeled it into focus rather than outburst. Eleanor had always used emotional manipulation when logical arguments failed her. Today, those tactics would find no purchase. "In 29 minutes, I said, checking my watch, "the executor of your late husband's estate will join us. Following him, representatives from the 3 main Harrington business holdings will arrive for an emergency meeting that I called this morning." I opened a leather portfolio containing a schedule. "At precisely 1:15, the family banker will present financial records dating back to 2002. At 1:30, your personal assistant, whom you fired last month for questioning certain expenditures, will provide sworn testimony about documents she was asked to destroy. Eleanor's perfectly manicured hand twitched slightly against the polished table. "This is absurd. I don't have time for—" "Make time, Mother," Richard interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "Because at 2 p.m., Alexandra and I will be making an announcement to the entire Harrington enterprise that will significantly alter your position within it." For the first time, genuine alarm flickered across Eleanor's face. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she attempted to send a message, likely to her financial advisor or personal attorney. Richard and I exchanged a glance. Mateo had already ensured that certain communications would be mysteriously delayed. Vivian slid another document across the table. "Mrs. Harrington, this details the unauthorized access to Alexandra's accounts during a 36-hour period, when she was in active labor and immediate recovery. The transactions bear your electronic signature, executed through a series of identity verifications that could only have been completed with access to Alexandra's personal identification documents. Documents that mysteriously disappeared from her hospital room while she was in delivery." Eleanor's mask of indifference finally slipped. "Those accounts were joint with Richard. As his mother, I was simply protecting family interests while he was distracted with the birth." "They were not joint accounts," Richard stated firmly. "And you know that, Mother. We've maintained separate finances since our marriage, which has always bothered you." My phone buzzed again. This time it was Sophia. "Dad just arrived at the firm with the baby, waiting in the partners' lounge as planned. Eleanor's driver confirmed he delivered her directly from a meeting with Jensen at First Boston Trust." "Perfect." Jensen, Eleanor's private banker, was already on our list of afternoon arrivals, but confirming their meeting this morning added another layer to our timeline of her desperate maneuvers over the past 6 weeks. 17 minutes until Walter arrives, I noted calmly, organizing the next series of revelations we had planned. "Perhaps we should discuss your meeting with Mr. Jensen this morning? The one where you attempted to liquidate several Harrington family holdings and transfer them to your personal offshore account?" Eleanor's composure cracked visibly. "You're having me followed?" "Not followed," Richard clarified. "Protected. The Harrington security team reports to me, not you. They always have. Father made certain of that after the incident with my college fund." Her eyes widened slightly at the mention of an event I knew had been carefully buried 20 years ago. Richard's discovery during his sophomore year at Harvard that his mother had drained his personal trust to purchase a competing company, only to dissolve it because its CEO had once refused her. "Advances." The intercom buzzed, and Vivian answered it with practiced efficiency. "Yes? Send him in." She turned to us. "Mr. Pennington has arrived early." Eleanor straightened, a flash of relief crossing her features. Walter Pennington had been the Harrington family attorney for over 30 years and had always favored Eleanor in family disputes. What she didn't know was that Walter had reached out to us 3 weeks ago after discovering certain irregularities in the family accounts that put him at professional risk. The door opened to reveal a distinguished man in his 70s, silver-haired, and carrying a leather portfolio similar to those already spread across the table. "Mrs. Harrington." He nodded to Eleanor before turning to me with unexpected warmth. "Mrs. Alexandra, Mr. Richard, I've brought the documents as requested." Eleanor's relief transformed into confusion as Walter took a seat beside Vivian rather than next to her. "Walter, what documents? I didn't request anything." "No, you didn't," Walter confirmed, his professional demeanor tinged with disappointment. "Your daughter-in-law did, in her capacity as trustee of the Harrington Family Trust." The color drained from Eleanor's face. "That's impossible. I'm the trustee of all Harrington trusts." "Not all of them," Richard said quietly, opening the ornate folder he'd brought with him. "My father created one final trust before his death, one that specifically excluded you from its management or benefits." Walter nodded, producing a document bearing the distinctive blue seal of the trust company. "The Edward Harrington Legacy, Trust was established with a very specific condition. Upon the birth of Richard's first child, full control would transfer to his spouse, circumventing both Richard himself and you, Eleanor. "That's preposterous," Eleanor hissed, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her dawning realization. "Edward would never—" "My father knew exactly what you were capable of," Richard interrupted. "He watched you manipulate and control every aspect of our family finances for decades. This was his insurance policy to protect his grandchildren from suffering the same financial coercion I experienced." My phone buzzed once more. A message from the head of security. "Mrs. Harrington's private security detail has been escorted from the building as requested. All access to Harrington residence systems transferred to your secured server." I nodded to Vivian, who made a brief note. Each piece was falling into place with meticulous precision. In the 13 minutes since Eleanor had entered this room, her world had begun to unravel in ways she couldn't yet fully comprehend. "I'd like to call my attorney," Eleanor said, her voice hardening as she reached again for her phone. "By all means," I replied, gesturing toward the device. Though I should mention that Jerome Wilkins was served with a subpoena this morning regarding his role in falsifying the documents used to sell my brownstone. He's currently meeting with the Bar Association's Ethics Committee. Eleanor's hand froze midway to her purse. The countdown was approaching its critical phase, each minute bringing another revelation, another piece of her carefully constructed facade crumbling away. Outside, the storm clouds had darkened further, the first drops of rain beginning to streak against the windows. Walter cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable but professional as ever. "There is also the matter of the financial audit that was triggered 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Alexandra requested a complete forensic accounting of all Harrington holdings, which revealed several irregularities that require immediate attention." "You have no authority to order an audit," Eleanor snapped, her carefully maintained poise finally slipping. "I am the head of this family." "Actually," I said, sliding the trust document toward her, "according to this, I am, at least where the money is concerned." I tapped a specific clause highlighted in yellow. "And this particular trust, the one you never knew existed, contains controlling interest in all 3 major Harrington enterprises." The look of shock that passed over Eleanor's face would have been satisfying if the circumstances weren't so serious. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protection. Protecting my daughter's future, my husband's legacy, and yes, my own financial independence that Eleanor had tried so desperately to destroy. Richard checked his watch. 7 minutes until the Harrington Enterprises board representatives arrive. "Mother, I suggest you use this time to decide how you want to proceed, cooperatively or otherwise." The weight of what was happening finally seemed to register with Eleanor. Her perfectly maintained exterior began to show cracks. Real ones this time, not the calculated shows of vulnerability she'd deployed throughout her life to manipulate those around her. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, and for the first time since I'd known her, there was genuine emotion in her voice. "Everything I've ever done was for this family." "No," Richard replied, his tone gentle but firm. "Everything you've done was for control. There's a difference." He reached for my hand across the table, a gesture of unity that spoke volumes. And now that control ends. 6 months earlier, life had followed its carefully planned trajectory. Richard and I had celebrated our 3rd wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at Maison Laurent, the French restaurant where we'd had our first date. We'd clinked glasses of sparkling cider, my concession to being 7 months pregnant, and talked excitedly about the nursery renovations in our Beacon Hill townhouse. Eleanor had sent an extravagant silver rattle with a note congratulating us on continuing the Harrington legacy, though she'd pointedly added that she hoped we'd finally consider moving to the family estate where a proper heir should be raised. Eleanor had always made her expectations crystal clear. The Harrington path was generations old, and deviation was not tolerated. Richard would run the family's investment firm after a suitable apprenticeship under Eleanor's watchful eye. I would transition from my charming hobby in historical architecture to a more appropriate role as a society wife, hosting charity galas and sitting on the right boards. Our children would attend Phillips Exeter Academy like all Harringtons, before them, followed by Harvard, and eventually take their place in Boston's elite business and social circles. Mrs. Harrington, Vivian's voice pulled me back to the present moment in the conference room. Would you like some water? You look pale. Eleanor ignored the offer, her attention fixed on the trust document before her. This can't be legal, she muttered, flipping through the pages with increasing agitation. Edward never mentioned this to me. That was rather the point, Walter replied, his tone professionally neutral despite the circumstances. Your husband came to me privately after his cancer diagnosis. He expressed concerns about your methods of financial control over Richard. The expected path for the birth of our daughter had been meticulously planned as well. I would deliver at Massachusetts General Hospital in the same luxury suite where Eleanor had given birth to Richard. The hospital's East Wing, renovated through generous Harrington donations, would provide the finest care while Eleanor managed everything else, from the nurse selection to the press announcement of the newest Harrington's arrival. The first photos would be taken by the same society photographer who had captured Richard's newborn portraits, and Eleanor had already scheduled Evelyn's first public appearance at the annual Harrington Foundation Gala, when she would be exactly 2 months old. My mother had planned to fly in from Arizona to help with the baby, but Eleanor had intervened, insisting that the Harrington family nanny of 30 years would be more appropriate. My sister Sophia had been quietly removed from the approved visitor list at the hospital, an administrative oversight that Eleanor had apologized for after the fact with practiced insincerity. I've prepared a statement, Eleanor said suddenly, reaching for her designer handbag. For the board meeting, as acting chairwoman of Harrington Enterprises, I should be the one to address any concerns about financial irregularities. Richard shook his head. You're no longer acting chairwoman, Mother. That position transferred to Alexandra the moment Evelyn was born. The look of disbelief on Eleanor's face would have been almost comical if the situation weren't so serious. You can't possibly expect anyone to believe that Alexandra, an architect with absolutely no business experience, is qualified to run a multinational corporation. Alexandra won't be running the corporation, Richard clarified. The trust establishes her as chairwoman with oversight authority, while the existing management team continues daily operations. Her role is to ensure the trust's integrity, something you've repeatedly compromised. The carefully orchestrated birth plan had collapsed spectacularly when my water broke during a contentious dinner at the Harrington estate. I had gone into labor 4 weeks early, while Eleanor was berating the catering staff about insufficient truffle shavings on the risotto. Richard had rushed me to the hospital while Eleanor had remained behind to manage the situation, promising to join us, after changing into more appropriate attire. By the time she arrived at the hospital 3 hours later, I was already in active labor. Instead of coming directly to the delivery room, Eleanor had stopped at the administrative office to verify arrangements, and then made a series of phone calls from the private waiting room that Richard's father had endowed. What we didn't know then was that those calls had set in motion the financial maneuvers that would empty my accounts and sell my brownstone project. The path forward is very clear, I said, returning to the present moment. The trust gives me authority to audit and restructure any Harrington entity. I've already begun that process. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. You've always resented me, haven't you? From the moment Richard brought you home, with your modest background and your determination to keep working as if you needed the money. Her voice dripped with disdain. I welcomed you into this family, gave you access to our connections, our influence. This is how you repay that generosity? Richard tensed beside me, but I placed a hand on his arm. Eleanor's attempts to reframe the narrative were predictable, a tactic she had employed countless times over the years. Paint herself as the victim, recast her controlling behavior as generosity, make others defensive rather than maintaining. Her accountability. "Your generosity," I repeated, my tone even. "Like when you told the Historical Society that my restoration plans for the Beacon Hill project were derivative and uninspired, after I declined to name their new wing after you? Or perhaps you mean your generosity in scheduling Richard for business trips that mysteriously coincided with every one of my prenatal appointments during the first trimester?" The intercom buzzed, interrupting the tense exchange. Vivian answered it with professional composure. "Yes, send them in." The door opened to reveal 3 distinguished individuals, the heads of the main Harrington business divisions. Their grave expressions suggested they had already been briefed on at least some aspects of the situation. Behind them, I glimpsed my father holding baby Evelyn in the reception area, exactly as planned. The sight of my daughter centered me, reinforcing the stakes of this confrontation. Mrs. Harrington, the eldest of the 3 executives, nodded to Eleanor before turning to me with equal deference. "Mrs. Alexandra, we understood there was an urgent financial matter to discuss." Eleanor stood abruptly. "James, this is a family misunderstanding that's gotten out of hand. My daughter-in-law is understandably emotional after childbirth and, please, sit down, Mother." Richard's voice was quiet but carried an authority I'd rarely heard him use with Eleanor. "This isn't a misunderstanding, and we all know it. The expected path after Evelyn's birth should have included my recovery in the luxury hospital suite, followed by a carefully orchestrated return to the Beacon Hill townhouse where Eleanor had arranged for a nursery designed by Boston's most exclusive interior decorator. There would be a formal introduction of the baby to Harrington family friends and business associates, followed by Evelyn's portrait being added to the family gallery at the estate. I would gradually be eased out of any meaningful decision-making regarding my daughter, as Eleanor established herself as the authority on proper Harrington child-rearing. Instead, I had been discharged from the hospital to discover my accounts empty, my professional project sold from under me, and Eleanor installed in our guest room, directing a team of personnel she had hired without consultation. Richard had been shocked by his mother's financial maneuvering but hesitant to confront her, directly until we understood the full extent of her actions. That hesitation had given us the time to investigate properly, uncovering not just her recent betrayal, but decades of financial manipulation and control. The executives took their seats at the conference table, creating a physical divide. Richard and I on one side with our legal team, Eleanor increasingly isolated on the other. The storm outside had intensified, rain now lashing against the windows as thunder rumbled in the distance. "Before we begin," I said, addressing the room while sliding a document toward the executives, "I'd like to formally introduce myself as the new chairwoman of the Harrington Family Trust, as established by Edward Harrington's final amendment to his will." Eleanor's face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. I've led this company for 20 years. You can't possibly—" "The documentation is in order," Walter interrupted, his loyalty to the late Edward Harrington apparently outweighing his decades-long relationship with Eleanor. "I've verified its authenticity and legal standing. Alexandra is indeed the controlling trustee." The 3 executives exchanged glances, clearly processing this significant shift in power. James Davidson, the silver-haired CEO of Harrington Properties, cleared his throat. "What exactly are we addressing today?" I opened a leather portfolio, revealing a series of meticulously organized financial records. Unauthorized transfers from corporate accounts to private holdings, systematic misrepresentation of company assets, and a pattern of financial decisions made for personal benefit rather than corporate interest. I looked directly at Eleanor, beginning with the liquidation of assets that occurred while I was in delivery with my daughter and extending back approximately 20 years. The expected path had been clear. Eleanor would maintain control of the Harrington fortune, using it to ensure everyone's compliance with her vision for the family legacy. Richard would eventually inherit a carefully curated portion of the wealth, provided he continued to meet his mother's expectations. I would be tolerated as his wife, but gradually marginalized, especially in matters concerning our children's upbringing and financial future. Instead, we sat in this conference room with rain hammering against the windows. The documentation of Eleanor's financial misconduct spread before us, and the power dynamic of the Harrington family permanently altered. The expected path had been obliterated the moment Eleanor decided to empty my accounts while I brought her grandchild into the world. She simply hadn't anticipated that her actions would trigger a contingency plan her late husband had put in place precisely to protect against such behavior. "I believe," I said, my voice steady as I met Eleanor's gaze across the polished mahogany table. "It's time to discuss your resignation from all Harrington Enterprises, effective immediately." The rainy Tuesday afternoon when I discovered Eleanor's betrayal remains etched in my memory with painful clarity. Evelyn was just 4 days old, a tiny bundle against my chest as I dozed in the hospital's recovery suite. Richard had stepped out to grab coffee from the cafe downstairs. Hospital coffee wasn't acceptable for a Harrington, Eleanor had reminded him repeatedly. The soft ping of an email alert barely registered through my exhaustion-induced haze, but something about the preview text on my phone screen cut through the fog. "Congratulations on the successful sale of your Beacon Hill property." My heart had stuttered as I clicked open the message. My brownstone project wasn't for sale. The historic building I'd spent 3 years meticulously restoring, the cornerstone of my architectural conservation portfolio, the project that had been scheduled for a feature in Architectural Digest, sold? The email from my realtor, Tim, was cheerful, congratulating me on accepting the all-cash offer from Westridge Properties, mentioning that all paperwork had been expedited as requested, and confirming that the closing had just been completed. I'd called Tim immediately, my fingers trembling as I punched in his number while trying not to disturb Evelyn. "Tim, I never listed the brownstone," I'd said, my voice barely above a whisper. There must be some mistake. The confusion in his voice had quickly given way to concern. "Alexandra, the listing came through your office with all the proper documentation. Your signature is on everything. The power of attorney forms were properly executed." He paused. "The buyer's representative was quite insistent on rushing the closing. She said you needed the liquidity immediately for medical expenses." "She?" My throat had constricted around the word. "Mrs. Eleanor Harrington. She handled everything as your authorized representative. While cradling my newborn daughter, I had learned that my professional masterpiece had been sold to a shell company for 30% below market value. A company I would later discover was controlled by Eleanor's longtime friend and sometimes rival, Victoria Chambers. "I'll need copies of everything," I'd told Tim, struggling to keep my voice steady as Evelyn stirred against me. "Every document, every form, every communication." After ending the call, I'd opened my banking app, a sense of dread expanding in my chest. The accounts I had maintained separately from our joint finances, my professional nest egg, the safety net I'd built through years of hard work, showed a balance of zero. Every dollar had been transferred out over the past 48 hours while I was in labor and immediate recovery. The final withdrawal had been completed just 4 hours after Evelyn's birth. Eleanor had entered my recovery room shortly after. That discovery, impeccably dressed as always, bearing a gift-wrapped package tied with silk ribbon. "Alexandra, darling, you look positively drained. Motherhood is so taxing on one's appearance." She had placed the package on my bedside table with a practiced smile. "A little something for the baby." I'd stared at her, this woman who had just systematically dismantled my financial independence while I was bringing her grandchild into the world, and something cold had settled in my chest. "Why did you sell my brownstone, Eleanor?" The briefest flicker of surprise had crossed her features before her social mask slid back into place. "Oh, you've heard already? I was going to discuss that when you were more recovered." She had adjusted her pearl necklace, a nervous tell I'd observed over years of tense family dinners. "It was a business decision, darling. The market is absolutely perfect right now, and that project was draining resources you'll need for the baby." "And my bank accounts?" I'd asked, my voice deceptively calm as Evelyn slept against me. "Were those draining resources too?" Eleanor had settled into the visitor's chair, smoothing her designer skirt. "Alexandra, you're emotional right now, which is perfectly natural after childbirth. Your hormones are simply everywhere." Her tone had been sympathetic but dismissive. The financial adjustments were necessary to consolidate the family's position. Richard agrees completely. The last part had been a calculated lie. Richard had been frantically trying to reach our bank to understand the unauthorized transfers. That had been flagged on his phone while I was in delivery. "Consolidate into whose accounts exactly?" I'd asked, stroking Evelyn's tiny back for comfort. Her comfort or mine, I wasn't sure. "The Harrington Family Trust, of course," Eleanor had replied smoothly. "Everything is being properly managed. You don't need to concern yourself with financial matters right now. Focus on the baby and recovering your figure." She had glanced meaningfully at my postpartum body. "I've taken the liberty of arranging for a nutritionist and personal trainer to visit the house next week." What Eleanor hadn't known as she sat there, radiating condescending benevolence, was that her actions had triggered a clause in Richard's father's trust, the trust she knew nothing about. Edward Harrington, after decades of watching his wife's manipulative control of family finances, had created a financial failsafe that would activate if Eleanor ever attempted to financially compromise Richard's spouse. "I need to rest now," I'd told her, my decision crystallizing as I held my daughter. This woman would never control Evelyn the way she had controlled Richard. Never. Eleanor had stood, patting my hand with practiced sympathy. "Of course, darling. Don't worry about a thing. I've already made arrangements for the baby's nursery at the estate. The townhouse is simply too urban for proper child rearing." After she left, I'd immediately texted my sister, Sophia, asking her to contact my attorney, Vivian Chang. Then I'd texted my college roommate, Diane, now a forensic accountant. By the time Richard returned with coffee, I had the beginnings of a plan forming. That evening, a nurse had brought discharge papers for me to sign, explaining that Eleanor had arranged for early release to a more suitable private environment. The presumption took my breath away. I was being discharged a day, early because Eleanor had decided it. I signed the forms with a hand that trembled with both exhaustion and growing resolve. Richard had wheeled me out to the hospital entrance where a Harrington family town car waited. "Mother's arranged for us to stay at the estate until you're recovered," he'd explained, helping me into the vehicle while carefully cradling Evelyn in her carrier. She thought it would be easier with the staff to help. "Did she mention selling my brownstone without permission?" I'd asked quietly, watching his expression shift from confusion to shock. "Or emptying my professional accounts while I was in labor?" The color had drained from his face. "What are you talking about?" "Your mother has systematically stripped me of all financial independence in the past 48 hours, I'd explained, my voice steady despite my exhaustion. "Every dollar I earned, every investment I made, gone. My professional centerpiece project, sold. All while I was bringing your daughter into the world." Richard's shock had quickly turned to disbelief, then anger, not at me, but at the impossible situation. He knew his mother was controlling, had admitted she was manipulative, but this level of calculated betrayal seemed beyond even what he believed her capable of. "There must be some explanation," he'd said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Some misunderstanding." I had pulled out my phone, showing him the banking app with its 0 balances, the email from the realtor, the document Sophia had already obtained showing the brownstone's new ownership. "This isn't a misunderstanding, Richard. This is financial abuse, and it happened while I was at my most vulnerable." He had stared at the evidence, his family loyalty warring with the indisputable facts before him. "What do you want to do?" He'd finally asked, reaching for my hand. "Not the estate," I'd replied firmly. "We go to the townhouse, tonight, and tomorrow we start fixing this." The driver had already been instructed to take us to the Harrington estate, where Eleanor would be waiting with the entire household staff and the new nursery she'd had decorated without our input. Making a decision, Richard had leaned forward. "Change of plans. Take us to Beacon Hill instead." The driver had hesitated, clearly having received explicit instructions from Eleanor. "Sir, Mrs. Harrington Sr. was very specific." "And I'm being very specific now," Richard had interrupted, his voice carrying an authority I'd rarely heard him use. "Take us home, to our home." That defiance, Richard choosing our family unit over his mother's commands, had been the first crack in Eleanor's control. As we'd pulled away from the hospital, I'd texted Vivian, setting a process in motion that would lead us to this confrontation in the law firm's conference room 6 weeks later. What Eleanor hadn't realized when she'd emptied my accounts and sold my brownstone was that she had triggered not just my investigation into her financial misconduct, but also the activation of Edward Harrington's final legacy. A trust designed specifically to break her control over the family fortune. Her attempt to render me financially dependent had instead given me control over the entire Harrington empire. The betrayal had been calculated, cruel, and perfectly timed to exploit my vulnerability. But it had backfired in ways Eleanor could never have anticipated as she'd sat in her study, systematically dismantling my financial independence while I brought her grandchild into the world. The Beacon Hill townhouse became our war room. While Richard managed appearances with his mother, attending weekly family dinners at the estate, and maintaining the illusion that we were simply adjusting to new parenthood, I orchestrated a multi-pronged investigation into Eleanor's financial activities that spanned decades. "You're certain you want to pursue this?" Vivian had asked during our first private meeting, 3 days after Evelyn's birth. I was still physically recovering, nursing my daughter while surrounded by financial documents spread across our dining room table. "The Harrington family has significant influence in Boston. This won't be easy." "She took everything while I was literally bringing life into the world," I'd replied, my voice steady despite my exhaustion. "This isn't just about money. It's about power and control. If I don't stop her now, she'll control every aspect of Evelyn's life too." Diane, my college roommate turned forensic accountant, arrived the following day with her team. They set up a secure workstation in our home office, creating an independent system that couldn't be monitored by Harrington IT staff, many of whom had worked for Eleanor for years. "We need to assume she has eyes everywhere," Diane warned, installing specialized encryption software. "The Harrington network is almost certainly compromised." Sophia moved into our guest room, ostensibly to help with the baby, but actually serving as our secure courier. Eleanor had never bothered to learn my sister's face, considering her unimportant in the Harrington social hierarchy. This oversight proved invaluable as Sophia moved freely between our home, Vivian's office, and various financial institutions, gathering documents without raising suspicion. Our first breakthrough came when Diane discovered a pattern in Eleanor's financial maneuvers, dating back to Richard's childhood. "She's been systematically consolidating control for decades," Diane explained, displaying a complex flowchart on her laptop. "Every trust, every inheritance, every business interest, all rerouted to accounts she personally controls." "What about my brownstone?" I asked, bouncing Evelyn gently as she fussed. "Why sell it to Victoria Chambers specifically?" Diane pulled up another document. "Victoria's company is planning a modern development that would overshadow your restoration project. Your historically accurate renovation would have established precedent for the neighborhood that might have blocked her development. 2 birds, 1 stone. Eliminate your professional achievement while helping her ally." Richard had been stunned by the evidence. I knew Mother was controlling, but this level of calculation. He trailed off, studying the financial trails his mother had created and concealed. She's been doing this my entire life. The investigation expanded when we contacted Walter Pennington, Edward Harrington's personal attorney. Initially reluctant to meet, Walter finally agreed to a discreet lunch at a restaurant far from his usual haunts. I've been concerned about certain irregularities for some time, he admitted, glancing nervously around the quiet cafe. But Eleanor's control of the family finances is absolute. Questioning her decisions has career consequences. Walter provided the first confirmation of the trust Edward had established, the trust that would give me control upon Evelyn's birth. Edward knew exactly who his wife was, Walter explained, passing me an encrypted USB drive under the table. This contains the original trust documents and Edward's private notes about why he created this particular arrangement. That night, after Evelyn had finally fallen asleep, Richard and I read through his father's private journals. Edward Harrington had documented years of financial manipulation by his wife, funds diverted from charitable causes to personal projects, business decisions made to settle personal vendettas, threats made to anyone who questioned her authority. The journals revealed a man trapped in a marriage of appearances, systematically marginalized from his own family's finances, watching helplessly as his wife used money to control their son. She did this to Dad too, Richard had whispered, his voice breaking as he read his father's words. All those years he was trying to protect me, and I never knew. The trust Edward had established was his final act of rebellion against decades of Eleanor's control. A financial time bomb designed to activate when the next generation of Harringtons arrived. Edward had correctly assessed that Eleanor would never be able to resist attempting to financially control Richard's spouse, especially once a child entered the picture. The trust was his insurance policy, ensuring that if Eleanor followed her pattern of financial manipulation, she would inadvertently trigger her own removal from power. Our investigation accelerated after we discovered Janet Murray, Eleanor's former executive assistant who had been abruptly retired 5 years earlier with a surprisingly modest severance package. Janet lived in a small apartment in Somerville, far from the luxury she should have been able to afford after 15 years as right hand to one of Boston's wealthiest women. She made me return the retirement gifts, Janet explained during our first meeting, serving tea in mismatched cups. The car, the watch, even the vacation vouchers, all taken back after the public retirement party. Said they were company property, not personal gifts. Janet's eyes had hardened. I'd seen her do it to others, but somehow thought I'd be different. Janet proved to be our most valuable resource. She had secretly maintained copies of Eleanor's private financial records, correspondence, and calendar for years. Insurance, she called it, though she'd never found the courage to use it. The SAO documentation revealed a pattern of vindictive financial retaliation against anyone who crossed Eleanor, including family members, business associates, and even charity board members who voted against her proposals. Here, Janet said, pointing to a calendar entry from 3 days before I went into labor. Meeting with Victoria Chambers regarding contingency acquisition. That would be your brownstone. She'd been planning this for weeks. Mateo Reyes, the private investigator Vivian recommended, specialized in financial crimes among Boston's elite. The ultra-wealthy leave different fingerprints, he explained during our initial consultation. They don't make rookie mistakes. They have layers of legitimate-looking structures hiding their actions. Mateo established surveillance on Eleanor's activities, documenting her meetings with financial advisors, attorneys, and business associates in the weeks following Evelyn's birth. His team tracked electronic transfers, recorded conversations in public spaces, and built a comprehensive picture of Eleanor's attempts to further consolidate control of Harrington assets while simultaneously constructing a narrative about my postpartum instability. She's telling people you're suffering from psychosis, Mateo reported, playing a recording from the Boston Symphony Orchestra fundraiser Eleanor had attended the previous night. Her voice was clearly audible, confiding to a board member that poor Alexandra was struggling with reality after the birth, requiring Eleanor to step in and protect family interests. The most damning evidence came from Eleanor's private banker, Jensen, though he didn't provide it willingly. Mateo's team had documented multiple meetings between Jensen and Eleanor where offshore transfers were arranged, transfers that violated banking regulations and SEC guidelines. Presented with evidence of his complicity, Jensen had reluctantly provided transaction records showing how Eleanor had systematically drained my accounts while I was in labor, using forged authorization documents. The signatures won't hold up to forensic examination, Diane confirmed, comparing the documents side by side. But she didn't need them to last forever, just long enough to complete the transfers and establish control. Our investigation expanded to include the Harrington Family Foundation, ostensibly a charitable organization, but effectively Eleanor's personal slush fund. Financial records revealed donations being redirected to projects benefiting Eleanor's social circle, grants awarded based on personal loyalty rather than merit, and systematic misrepresentation to tax authorities about the foundation's activities. Throughout this intense investigation period, Richard maintained a precarious balancing act. He attended family functions at the estate, listened patiently to his mother's plans for Evelyn's future, and gave no indication that we were building a case that would end her control. His performance was flawless, the dutiful son navigating new fatherhood, seemingly acquiescing to his mother's guidance while secretly working to dismantle her power. "She wants us to bring Evelyn to the club gala next week," Richard reported after another tense family dinner, "to introduce her to the right sort of people," as she puts it. "Perfect timing," I'd replied, showing him Mateo's latest report. "That's exactly when Jensen will be meeting with federal banking regulators about those offshore accounts." 6 weeks of meticulous investigation had yielded a comprehensive picture of Eleanor's financial misdeeds. The evidence was overwhelming. Decades of manipulation, fraud, tax evasion, and breach of fiduciary duty, all documented in excruciating detail. More importantly, we had confirmed the existence and validity of Edward's trust, which gave me legal control of the Harrington financial empire. The final piece came when Walter Pennington contacted us directly, something he had carefully avoided doing throughout the investigation. "Eleanor has scheduled an emergency board meeting for next week," he informed us in a hushed phone call. "She's planning to restructure the family holdings in a way that would permanently exclude both of you from control, using your absence from company operations during the postpartum period as justification." The time for watching and gathering evidence was over. Eleanor had accelerated her timeline, which meant we needed to accelerate ours. After consulting with Vivian, Diane, and Mateo, we developed our counterattack, a carefully orchestrated confrontation that would take place before Eleanor could implement her restructuring plan. "Are you ready for this?" Richard asked the night before our planned meeting, as we stood in Evelyn's nursery watching our daughter sleep. "Once we start, there's no going back. The family will never be the same." I touched Evelyn's tiny hand, watching as her fingers instinctively curled around mine. "Your family was never what she pretended it was," I said softly. "Your father knew that. He created this trust for a reason, to break the cycle of control." Richard nodded, his expression resolute as he looked at our daughter. "Tomorrow, then." The pieces were in place. The evidence was organized. The key witnesses were prepared. After 6 weeks of secret investigation, we were ready to confront Eleanor with the truth of her actions and reclaim the future she had tried to steal, not just my financial independence, but our daughter's right to grow up free from the manipulation that had defined the Harrington family for generations. The morning of our confrontation arrived with an unseasonable October chill. Boston had awakened to frost-covered gardens and a slate-gray sky threatening rain. Appropriate weather for the storm we were about to unleash. I rose before dawn, moving carefully to avoid waking Richard or Evelyn, and made my way to our home office where the final preparations awaited. The dining table had been transformed into a command center over the previous 6 weeks. Laptops, secure phones, file folders color-coded by type of financial malfeasance, and a detailed timeline of Eleanor's activities spanning decades. I ran my fingers over the leather portfolio that contained the most damning evidence, organized for maximum impact. The presentations had been rehearsed, the documents duplicated and secured in multiple locations, and contingency plans established for every possible reaction Eleanor might have. "Morning," Sophia whispered, entering with 2 cups of coffee. Unlike me, my sister was a natural early riser. Diane's team just confirmed the final transfers. Eleanor moved another $2 million from the foundation accounts yesterday. She set my coffee beside a stack of financial records, straight to her personal offshore account in Grand Cayman. I nodded, adding this information to our timeline. Perfect timing. Did Mateo's team already documented the transfer and notified the IRS team discreetly? Sophia confirmed. They'll have the records waiting when we need them. The doorbell rang precisely at 6:30 a.m. Vivian Chang arriving for our final preparation session. She entered looking immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, carrying a slim briefcase containing the legal documents we would need. "The conference room at Blackwell is prepared," she reported, accepting the coffee Sophia offered. "Security protocols are in place, and the technical team has verified all systems are functioning correctly." We gathered around the dining table for one final review. The plan was intricate, with multiple phases designed to systematically dismantle Eleanor's defenses while presenting her with increasingly irrefutable evidence. "The board members will arrive separately," Vivian confirmed, checking her tablet. "Davidson first, then Miller, then Watkins, each given slightly different arrival times to prevent any opportunity for them to coordinate responses with Eleanor." I reviewed the seating chart we'd designed for the conference room, position and proximity carrying subtle messages about alliance and authority. Eleanor would enter to find herself increasingly isolated as the meeting progressed, both physically and metaphorically. "Walter will present the trust documentation at exactly 12:15, I noted, checking our detailed schedule. That gives Eleanor 15 minutes to attempt her standard deflection tactics before we introduce the legal bombshell. Richard joined us, cradling Evelyn, who had awakened for her morning feeding. He looked both resolute and slightly haunted, a man preparing to confront not just his mother, but the mythology of family that had shaped his entire life. "Jensen called," he said quietly, handing our daughter to me. "Mother contacted him last night, trying to arrange additional transfers before the board meeting. He declined, citing regulatory concerns." "She's getting nervous," Vivian observed, accelerating her plans. My father arrived next, having flown in from Arizona specifically for today. A retired judge with a specialty in family law he brought, both emotional support and professional gravitas to our team. "The car service is confirmed," he reported, embracing me carefully to avoid disturbing Evelyn. "I'll take the baby during the meeting as planned. We'll be in the partners' lounge, just 2 floors away." The final preparations moved with precision. As team members arrived, each with specific responsibilities. Diane's forensic accounting team established a secure link to their off-site servers where backup copies of all financial evidence were stored. Mateo delivered updated surveillance footage showing Eleanor's movements over the past 24 hours, including 3 separate meetings with her personal attorney, meetings that our sources confirmed had focused on strategies to discredit me based on postpartum mental instability. "She's planning to have you declared temporarily incompetent," Mateo explained, showing us notes his team had obtained from her attorney's assistant, claiming concern for your health and the baby's welfare. "How predictable," I replied, feeling a strange calm despite the magnitude of what we were about to do. "Add it to the presentation sequence, right after we reveal the brownstone sale documentation." Janet Murray, Eleanor's former assistant, arrived looking nervous but determined. Her testimony about Eleanor's financial manipulations would be crucial, particularly regarding the systematic pattern of behavior that established intent rather than isolated incidents. "I've brought the original notebooks," Janet said, placing a stack of leather-bound journals on the table. "Every instruction, every transfer, every vindictive decision, all recorded in her own words or mine for 15 years. While the team finalized preparations, I nursed Evelyn in the quiet of the nursery, savoring this moment of peace before the confrontation." Richard joined us, sitting silently beside the rocking chair. "Second thoughts?" I asked softly, stroking Evelyn's cheek as she fed. "No," he replied after a moment. "Just reflecting on how different this is from what I imagined growing up. The Harrington legacy was always presented as something sacred, something to be protected at all costs." He watched our daughter with gentle eyes. "I never understood that the real legacy worth protecting was this: family based on love and truth, not power and control." The nursery walls were painted a soft green. My choice, despite Eleanor's insistence on traditional Harrington blue. This small act of independence had infuriated her, though she'd disguised her reaction as concern about design coherence. Looking around at the room we had created for our daughter, I felt the rightness of what we were about to do. We returned to the dining room where the team was conducting final checks on all equipment and documentation. Sophia had arranged my suit, a tailored charcoal ensemble that projected authority without ostentation. Eleanor always dressed to intimidate, designer. Labels, statement jewelry, deliberate symbols of wealth. My appearance would be a calculated contrast, professional, understated competence. "The car will arrive in 30 minutes, Vivian announced, reviewing our schedule. Eleanor confirmed, her attendance at the reconciliation lunch you proposed. "She's expecting to meet you alone at noon." I nodded, mentally rehearsing the script we had prepared. The invitation to Eleanor had been carefully worded, suggesting a private conversation to resolve our misunderstanding about the financial matters. Her eagerness to accept confirmed our assessment of her strategy. Isolate me from Richard, present a narrative about protecting the family's interests, and establish my alleged mental instability before the board meeting she had scheduled for. Later that afternoon. "What she doesn't know," Richard added grimly, "is that her board meeting has been rescheduled and relocated to Blackwell's offices with a significantly different agenda." The final half hour before departure was a choreographed sequence of last-minute confirmations. My father prepared to take charge of Evelyn during the meeting. Sophia packed the baby's supplies with military precision. Mateo's team confirmed their positions around Blackwell and Associates and the Harrington estate. Diane verified secure backups of all financial records. Janet reviewed her talking points one final time. Richard and I changed into our professional attire, matching in understated elegance, a united front. As I fastened my grandmother's pearls, my only jewelry for the day, I caught sight of my reflection, 6 weeks postpartum, still carrying the physical markers of recent childbirth, eyes shadowed from interrupted sleep, but standing straight with absolute certainty about the path ahead. "Ready?" Richard asked, appearing behind me in the mirror. "Beyond ready," I replied, turning to face him. "This ends today." We gathered in the foyer for a final briefing. Vivian distributed secure phones to key team members, each programmed with emergency contacts and coded messages for various contingencies. Sophia confirmed that Eleanor's regular driver had reported her departure from the Harrington estate, precisely on schedule for our meeting. "Remember," Vivian cautioned, "Eleanor has spent decades cultivating allies throughout Boston's financial and legal communities. Expect her to attempt to leverage those connections once she realizes what's happening." "That's why timing is essential," I affirmed, reviewing our schedule once more. Each revelation is sequenced to systematically eliminate her potential escape routes before she can deploy them. My father approached with Evelyn in his arms, her tiny face peaceful in sleep, unaware of the seismic shift about to occur in her family's dynamics. I touched her cheek gently, drawing strength from her presence. "This is for you," I whispered, "so you'll never know what it's like to have your independence stripped away by someone who claims to love you." The sleek black town car arrived exactly on schedule. As we prepared to depart, I took one final look at the evidence assembled through 6 weeks of meticulous investigation. The documented history of Eleanor's financial manipulations, the trust documents that would shift control irrevocably, and the recently emptied accounts that had triggered this reckoning. Richard helped me into my coat, his hands steady despite the emotional weight of the coming confrontation. "She'll try to make this about her," he said quietly. "About her feelings, her intentions, her version of what family means." "I know," I replied, picking up the leather portfolio containing the most crucial documents, the ones I would need for the initial phase before the full team assembled. "That's why we're not giving her the opportunity to define the narrative." We moved toward the door, a small procession of justice in motion. Sophia carried additional evidence files, Vivian her legal briefcase, Janet the notebooks documenting years of Eleanor's machinations. My father followed with Evelyn, ready to take a separate car to Blackwell and Associates. The morning sky had darkened further, promising rain as we stepped outside. Appropriate weather for the storm we were about to unleash in the carefully controlled world Eleanor Harrington had constructed. A world built on manipulation and control that was about to face the consequences of decades of financial misconduct. As I settled into the town car, I checked my watch. Exactly 2 hours until we were scheduled to meet Eleanor in the conference room of Blackwell and Associates. 2 hours until the elaborate trap we had constructed over 6 weeks of secret investigation would spring closed around the woman who had emptied my accounts while I was bringing her grandchild into the world. "Blackwell and Associates," Richard instructed the driver as we pulled away from the curb. "The private entrance, please." The wheels were in motion. The countdown had begun. The atrium of Blackwell and Associates soared 15 stories above us, all steel and glass and quiet power. As our group moved through security with prearranged clearance, heads turned subtly in recognition of the Harrington name. The receptionist greeted Richard with practiced deference, her eyes flickering with curiosity at the assembled team accompanying him. This wasn't a standard legal consultation. It had the unmistakable energy of something momentous. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrington," she nodded politely. "The Astor conference room is prepared as requested. Your additional guests may proceed directly to the 22nd floor." We separated according to plan. My father took Evelyn to the partners' lounge 2 floors away, where he would wait until called. Diane and her forensic team established themselves in an adjacent room where they could provide real-time financial analysis as needed. Mateo positioned his surveillance specialists throughout the building, maintaining a digital perimeter around our proceedings. Sophia, Vivian, Richard, and I proceeded to the executive elevator bank, using the private keycard Blackwell had provided to access the upper floors. As the doors closed, sealing us into momentary privacy, I felt the weight of the portfolio in my hands. Documentation of Eleanor's systematic betrayal, meticulously organized for maximum impact. "Remember," Vivian cautioned quietly as the elevator ascended, "Eleanor has spent decades operating in Boston's highest circles. She'll have contingency plans, escape routes, prepared narratives. Our advantage is that she doesn't know how much we know." I nodded, mentally reviewing the sequence we had established. First my accounts and the brownstone, then the pattern of financial control, then the trust documentation, each revelation building on the last, eliminating her possible responses before she can deploy them. The elevator doors opened onto the 22nd floor, rarefied air where Boston's most consequential legal negotiations occurred. The hallway was hushed, the carpet thick enough to swallow our footsteps as we moved toward the Astor conference room. Through glass walls, I glimpsed panoramic views of Boston Harbor, now gray and choppy beneath storm clouds that mirrored the confrontation about to unfold. James Davidson, CEO of Harrington Properties, was already waiting in a small anteroom adjacent to the conference space. His expression was carefully neutral, though concern flickered in his eyes as he greeted us. "Richard, Alexandra, this is unexpected. Thank you for adjusting your schedule, James," Richard replied smoothly. "Mother will be arriving shortly, under the impression she's meeting Alexandra alone for a reconciliation lunch." Davidson's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. And the other board members?" "Arriving separately, as requested," Vivian confirmed, checking her tablet. "Mrs. Harrington Sr. should be here in approximately 12 minutes. Staff from Blackwell's executive services team appeared with refreshments, coffee service, water, a discreet arrangement of pastries that would remain untouched. The performative hospitality of high-stakes negotiations. We declined politely, too focused on the coming confrontation for social niceties. The technical team completed final checks on the room's presentation system, confirming that all digital evidence could be displayed on the wall screens when required. The conference table had been arranged precisely as requested, Eleanor's preferred seat positioned directly across from where Richard and I would sit, the symbolism unmistakable. Walter. Pennington arrived next, looking uncomfortable but resolute. As Edward Harrington's personal attorney and executor of his estate, Walter's presence carried particular significance. He nodded to us, his expression grave. "The trust documentation is prepared as requested. I've brought the original files. From Edward's private vault." "Thank you, Walter," I said, accepting the sealed portfolio he offered. "I know this position is difficult for you." He adjusted his bow tie nervously. "I served Edward Harrington for 30 years. His intentions regarding this trust were explicit. I'm simply fulfilling my professional obligation to my late client." Miller and Watkins, the remaining board members, arrived within minutes of each other, Miller looking confused, Watkins displaying the careful blankness of a veteran corporate operator assessing an unexpected situation. Neither asked direct questions, following the professional courtesy of waiting for the meeting to formally begin before demanding explanations. Vivian received a text from security. "Eleanor has arrived in the lobby. She's alone." Richard straightened. Imperceptibly, the moment of truth approaching. Despite 6 weeks of preparation, this confrontation with his mother represented the dissolution of family mythology that had shaped his entire life. I reached for his hand beneath the table, feeling the slight tremor in his fingers before they steadied against mine. "Places, everyone," Vivian directed quietly. We assumed our positions in the carefully choreographed tableau we had designed. Richard and I sat side by side at the center of the conference table, Vivian slightly behind us with legal documents arranged before her. The board members took their assigned seats, creating a physical representation of corporate governance. Walter positioned himself near the digital display where he would present Edward's trust documentation at the critical moment. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I watched Eleanor emerge from the elevator. Even from a distance, her commanding presence was evident. Perfect posture, designer attire, the confident stride of a woman accustomed to deference. She paused briefly at the sight of the assembled group visible through the glass, her composure slipping for just a moment before her social mask locked back into place. The conference room door opened, and Eleanor Harrington entered a space she had expected to control. The subtle widening of her eyes as she registered the full assembly confirmed that our first strategic advantage had been achieved. "Surprise. Richard," she said, her voice betraying only the slightest tension. "I wasn't expecting you to join Alexandra and me for lunch." Her gaze swept the room, taking in the board members, Walter, the legal team. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard rose, his voice steady. "Mother, please take a seat. This isn't a lunch meeting. This is a formal discussion regarding Harrington. Family finances." Eleanor's practiced smile remained in place, though it tightened at the edges. She moved toward her customary seat at the head of the table, only to find it occupied by James Davidson. a small but significant disruption to her expected authority. "I see," she said, smoothly adjusting to take the seat we had left available. Directly, across from us, subtly isolated. "Though I must say, darling, this seems unnecessarily formal for what is essentially a family matter." "That's where you're mistaken, Eleanor," I replied, opening my portfolio. "This is simultaneously a family matter and a legal one. It concerns actions you've taken that have significant implications for both." Her gaze hardened as it fixed on me, the pretense of maternal warmth evaporating. "Alexandra, I understand that new motherhood is overwhelming, especially with your background. Perhaps you're misinterpreting standard financial procedures." Condescension in her tone was familiar, a strategy she had employed repeatedly to undermine my confidence in family discussions. Today, it simply confirmed that she would follow predictable patterns of deflection. "Let's clarify exactly what we're discussing," I said, activating the digital display. The screen illuminated with bank statements, my personal and professional accounts, showing systematic withdrawals during the exact hours I had been in labor. "These are unauthorized transfers from my accounts, executed while I was delivering." "Your granddaughter?" Eleanor barely glanced at the display. "Richard asked me to consolidate family resources during that stressful time. As you were indisposed, I simply helped manage priorities." "I never authorized those transfers, Mother," Richard interjected, his voice quiet but firm. "Nor did I authorize the sale of Alexandra's brownstone project." The real estate documentation appeared on screen, the rushed sale, the below-market value, the forged authorizations. Eleanor's signature appeared repeatedly, alongside timestamps that matched precisely with Evelyn's delivery. "The brownstone was a financial drain," Eleanor replied smoothly, addressing the board members rather than us. "As family financial manager, I made an executive decision to liquidate an underperforming asset before it could further impact Harrington Holdings." "The brownstone wasn't a Harrington holding," I countered, advancing to the next slide. "Documentation of the property's independent ownership under my professional corporation. It was my separate asset, purchased with my funds, renovated with my capital, and scheduled to establish my independent professional reputation through the Architectural Digest feature." Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. "Semantics. Once you married into this family, your assets became part of the collective Harrington portfolio I oversee." James Davidson shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the legally questionable assertion. Watkins, the most financially astute board member, leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening. "That's not how marital property works in Massachusetts," Vivian stated precisely, particularly given the prenuptial agreement that specifically protected Alexandra's professional assets. Eleanor's smile tightened further. "The prenup was a formality to satisfy Alexandra's unusual independence streak. Within the family, we operate as a unified financial entity." The moment had arrived for our first major revelation. I nodded to Vivian, who activated the next display, a comprehensive timeline of Eleanor's financial maneuvers spanning 2 decades, meticulously documented with bank records, correspondence, and witness statements. "This isn't about a single incident during my labor," I said, my voice steady. "This is about a systematic pattern of financial control and manipulation you've employed throughout your management of Harrington resources." Eleanor's expression remained impassive, though I noticed her hand tighten slightly around her pen. "This is absurd. I've grown the family fortune exponentially. Every decision has been made to protect and enhance Harrington interests." "Whose interests specifically?" Richard asked, advancing the display to show particular transactions, diverted foundation funds, manipulated business acquisitions, vindictive financial maneuvers against perceived rivals. "Because many of these decisions appear to serve your personal vendettas rather than family prosperity." For the first time, Eleanor seemed genuinely caught off guard by the extent of our documentation. Her gaze moved rapidly between the display and the board members, calculating potential allies. Finding none, she straightened, abandoning pretense for authority. "I've managed this family's fortune for 30 years, she declared, addressing the board directly. "Through recessions, market upheavals, and countless challenges. I don't expect my methods to be understood by those without my experience or vision." Davidson cleared his throat. "Eleanor, these documents suggest more than unconventional methods. They indicate potentially actionable breaches of fiduciary duty." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "I built Harrington Enterprises into what it is today. Every decision documented there was made with appropriate authority." The door opened quietly, and Janet Murray entered, carrying her leather-bound notebooks. Eleanor's composure visibly faltered at the sight of her former assistant. "Not according to the contemporaneous records I kept," Janet said, taking the seat Vivian indicated, "including notes from meetings where you explicitly directed actions you knew violated trust agreements and corporate governance standards." The mood in the room shifted perceptibly. What Eleanor had likely dismissed as an emotional family confrontation was revealing itself as something far more comprehensive, a methodically constructed case backed by years of evidence and credible witnesses. "This is the moment of truth, Eleanor," I said quietly, meeting her gaze across the polished mahogany table. "We know everything, not just about my accounts and the brownstone, but about all of it: the foundation misappropriations, the offshore transfers, the systematic financial manipulation you've employed to control everyone around you." Eleanor's eyes darted to Richard, seeking the filial loyalty she had cultivated through decades of emotional manipulation. Finding only resolve in her son's expression, she straightened, switching tactics. "This theatrical production is clearly orchestrated by Alexandra," she addressed the board, voice hardening. "A woman suffering from postpartum psychological issues, manipulating my son during a vulnerable time. I've already consulted specialists about having her evaluated for—" "Mother," Richard interrupted, his voice carrying unprecedented authority. "Stop." The single word, delivered with quiet intensity, silenced Eleanor mid-sentence. In the momentary quiet that followed, Walter Pennington rose from his seat, carrying the sealed portfolio containing Edward Harrington's final legacy. "I believe," Walter said carefully, "this is the appropriate time to address the matter of the Edward Harrington Legacy Trust." Walter Pennington's announcement about Edward Harrington's Legacy Trust hung in the air, creating a palpable shift in the conference room's atmosphere. Eleanor's expression hardened as she turned to face her late husband's attorney. "Walter, there is no such trust," she stated with absolute certainty. "Edward and I maintained complete transparency regarding all family financial matters. I was the executor of his estate and trustee of all Harrington family trusts upon his death." Walter adjusted his bow tie, a nervous habit I'd observed throughout our preparation meetings. "Not all of them, Eleanor." His voice gained strength as he continued. "Edward created this trust privately, with me as the sole legal representative. It was established according to his explicit instructions 3 months before his death." Eleanor's perfectly manicured nails tapped against the polished mahogany table, a subtle tell of agitation she rarely displayed in public. "This is preposterous. I would have known." "That was precisely the point," Walter replied, opening the sealed portfolio to reveal documents bearing Edward Harrington's distinctive signature and the embossed seal of the trust company. "Edward specifically structured this trust to remain unknown to you until its activation trigger occurred." The board members exchanged glances, clearly processing this unexpected development. James Davidson leaned forward to examine the trust documentation, his financial acumen engaged. "When was this trust activated?" 6 weeks ago, I answered, watching Eleanor's face closely. "The day Evelyn was born." Eleanor's composure slipped momentarily, genuine confusion breaking through her carefully maintained facade. This was the revelation she hadn't anticipated, the explanation for our confidence, the source of authority she hadn't accounted for in her calculations. The Edward Harrington Legacy Trust, Walter continued, displaying the key provisions on the conference room screen, contains controlling interest in all three major Harrington enterprises. It was established with a very specific succession plan. Upon the birth of Richard's first child, full control would transfer to his spouse as primary trustee. The color drained from Eleanor's face as the implications became clear. That's impossible. Edward would never have— He did, Richard interrupted gently. Dad created this trust specifically to prevent the pattern of financial control you've established from extending to the next generation. Walter nodded, adjusting his glasses as he read directly from Edward's letter of intent, included in the trust documentation. Having observed the manipulation of financial resources as a method of control within my family for decades, I hereby establish this trust to ensure that future generations of Harringtons will be protected from such influence. The designated trustee, the parent who did not grow up under this system of control, will have the independence necessary to make decisions based on the true best interests of my grandchildren. Eleanor's breathing had become shallow, her legendary composure cracking under the weight of her late husband's posthumous rebellion against her authority. Edward had no right to make such arrangements without consulting me. This trust cannot possibly be valid. It was validated by the probate court 5 years ago, Walter confirmed, displaying the legal certification. All requirements for establishment of an irrevocable trust were meticulously followed. Edward was particularly thorough about ensuring its legal unassailability. The storm outside had intensified, rain now lashing against the conference room windows as thunder rumbled in the distance. The pathetic fallacy wasn't lost on me, nature's drama providing a backdrop to the human one unfolding in this rarefied corporate space. Eleanor turned to Richard, attempting to reestablish the maternal connection that had always been her most effective tool. Darling, surely you can't support this. Your father was ill when he made these arrangements, not thinking clearly. This trust undermines everything we've built together. That's not true, Mother, Richard replied steadily. Dad was completely lucid when he established this trust. I know because he discussed it with me. This revelation visibly shocked Eleanor. Her hand froze midway to her water glass, the careful script she had been following suddenly obsolete. You knew? All this time? Richard nodded, meeting his mother's gaze directly. Not the specific details. Walter maintained the confidentiality Dad requested, but the general purpose. Dad wanted to ensure that when I had children, they wouldn't experience the same financial manipulation he had watched you use throughout our family's history. Eleanor's expression hardened, her vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. She turned to the board members, switching tactics. Gentlemen, surely you understand the implications here. Harrington Enterprises cannot be controlled by an outsider with no experience in our business operations. Alexandra is an architect, not a financial manager. James Davidson studied the trust documentation with professional interest. The structure appears sound. Mrs. Alexandra would serve as controlling trustee, but day-to-day operations would remain with the current management team, subject to her oversight. This is exactly how many family trusts operate, Walter added. Edward was careful to ensure business continuity while changing the ultimate authority structure. Eleanor's gaze swept the room, searching for allies and finding none. The board members were reviewing the trust documentation with growing acceptance. Walter stood firm beside the evidence of his late client's wishes. Richard remained united with me, our hands joined on the table in visible solidarity. Shifting strategies again, Eleanor turned to me directly. Alexandra, be reasonable. This position requires experience you simply don't have. Perhaps we can reach a compromise. You maintain nominal control while I continue managing the actual operations. That won't be possible, I replied calmly. The trust specifically prohibits you from maintaining any management role in Harrington finances. Edward was quite explicit about that provision. Walter nodded, displaying the relevant clause. Under no circumstances shall Eleanor Harrington maintain any financial authority, direct or indirect, over trust assets or operations. Her demonstrated pattern of using financial resources to manipulate family members necessitates her complete removal from all aspects of trust management. The brutality of Edward's assessment, preserved in legal language and revealed years after his death, landed like a physical blow. Eleanor's perfect posture faltered slightly, the first visible crack in her carefully maintained image of invulnerability. "Edward was always weak," she said, her voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard before. "Too sentimental, too easily manipulated by others. This trust is simply another example of his poor judgment." "Is that why you maintained separate financial accounts he knew nothing about?" I asked, signaling Vivian to display the next piece of evidence. "Accounts funded with diverted Harrington resources?" The screen filled with documentation of Eleanor's private financial empire, offshore accounts, shell companies, properties held under various corporate entities, all carefully concealed from both Edward and the Harrington corporate structure. These revelations clearly surprised the board members, who exchanged concerned glances. "Business necessities," Eleanor dismissed, though her voice lacked its usual authority. "Contingency planning that Edward wouldn't have understood. Contingency planning that violated your fiduciary responsibility to both the family and the corporation," Vivian clarified, "and directly contradicted the terms of your marriage agreement with Edward." Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she studied me with new awareness. The underestimated daughter-in-law had revealed herself as a formidable opponent. "You've been quite thorough," she acknowledged, professional despite her obvious anger. "How long have you been investigating me?" "Since the day I discovered you." "Had emptied my accounts while I was in labor," I replied simply. 6 weeks of methodical investigation, building on evidence that others had been gathering for years. I nodded to Sophia, who opened the door to admit Janet Murray. Eleanor's former assistant carried additional notebooks documenting years of financial manipulations she had witnessed. "Janet," Eleanor acknowledged coldly, "I should have known your retirement was too amenable. You took back every retirement gift publicly presented," Janet replied steadily, "including the pension you promised. Did you really expect continued loyalty?" The pieces of our case continued to fall methodically into place, each revelation building on the previous one. Diane entered with her forensic accounting team, presenting their analysis of Eleanor's systematic diversion of Harrington resources over 2 decades. Matteo followed with surveillance documentation, proving Eleanor's recent attempts to transfer additional assets beyond the reach of family oversight. As each new witness presented their evidence, Eleanor's isolation became increasingly apparent. The authority she had wielded unchallenged for decades was crumbling under the weight of irrefutable documentation. The board members' expressions shifted from skepticism to concern to undisguised alarm as the full extent of her financial misconduct became clear. "This is more than irregular financial management," Davidson observed gravely. "These transactions potentially expose Harrington Enterprises to significant legal liability. A separate investigation into tax implications has already begun," Vivian confirmed. "The IRS has received documentation regarding discrepancies in foundation reporting spanning 15 years. Eleanor's gaze darted between the presentations and the increasingly concerned board members. Her legendary composure was fraying visibly now, the careful social mask slipping to reveal glimpses of the ruthless operator beneath. "This orchestrated character assassination is beneath even you. Alexandra, using my son to—" "Mother," Richard interrupted firmly. "This ends now. The manipulation, the financial control, all of it. Alexandra isn't using me. We're united in this decision." To underscore this unity, he activated the final display, a comprehensive restructuring plan for Harrington Enterprises that we had developed together, emphasizing ethical governance, transparent financial management, and legitimate philanthropic commitments. The plan clearly bore the hallmarks of both Richard's business acumen and my organizational perspective, a true partnership. Effective immediately, I stated, you are removed from all positions within Harrington Enterprises and its subsidiaries. Your access to all corporate and family accounts has been terminated. The brownstone sale will be legally challenged and reversed. My personal funds will be restored from your offshore accounts. You can't possibly— We already have, Richard said quietly. The legal documentation was filed this morning. Your office has been secured and your credentials revoked. It's over, Mother. Eleanor stared at us, the reality of her situation finally penetrating. Decades of unopposed authority had not prepared her for this moment of complete reversal. She straightened, her aristocratic bearing reasserting itself as she grasped for her remaining weapon, social standing. The implications for the family's reputation will be devastating, she warned, addressing the board rather than us. The scandal, the publicity, Harrington philanthropic initiatives will suffer irreparable damage. Actually, I replied, we've prepared for that as well. I signaled Vivian, who distributed copies of our public relations strategy, a carefully crafted approach that separated Eleanor's personal misconduct from the legitimate operations of Harrington Enterprises. The foundation will continue its charitable work under new management, Richard explained. All legitimate philanthropic commitments will be honored. Only the inappropriate financial practices will be discontinued. Eleanor looked from face to face around the conference table, searching for an ally and finding none. The evidence was too comprehensive, the documentation too thorough, the legal position too solid. Her kingdom had fallen in a single, meticulously planned meeting. I see, she said finally, her voice tight with controlled fury. And I suppose you expect me to simply accept this coup without resistance? I met her gaze directly. What I expect, Eleanor, is that you'll recognize the irrefutable nature of the evidence presented and choose the option that preserves whatever remains of your dignity and freedom. Vivian placed a final document before Eleanor, a settlement agreement that would allow her to retire with financial security, but without control of Harrington resources. The alternative, unstated but clear to everyone in the room, was public exposure and potential criminal charges for decades of financial misconduct. Thunder crashed outside as Eleanor stared at the document, the final punctuation to the storm we had brought into her carefully controlled world. After decades of wielding absolute authority over the Harrington fortune, she faced a binary choice: graceful exit or public disgrace. You'll regret this, she said softly, her eyes fixed on me with cold intensity. Both of you. No, Mother, Richard replied with quiet certainty. The only regret is that it came to this at all. Eleanor's pen hovered over the settlement agreement, the moment of truth crystallized in a single signature that would formalize the end of her reign. Outside, the storm continued to lash against the windows of Blackwell and Associates, nature's drama providing the perfect backdrop for the human one reaching its inevitable conclusion within. Eleanor's pen remained suspended above the settlement. Agreement! Her hesitation hanging in the air like the static charge before lightning strikes. The conference room had fallen completely silent. The only sound, the rhythmic drumming of rain against the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. If I refuse to sign? She finally asked, her voice carrying none of its usual, imperious confidence. Then we proceed with full legal action, Vivian replied matter-of-factly. The documentation of financial misconduct would be submitted to the appropriate authorities. Given the evidence we've compiled, charges would likely include fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, and breach of fiduciary duty. Eleanor's gaze shifted to Richard, searching for any remnant of the filial loyalty she had cultivated through decades of careful manipulation. Is this truly what you want? To destroy your mother's reputation? To dismantle everything I've built? For this family? "What you built," Richard replied quietly, "was a system of control, not a legacy of love. Dad saw it. I've always known it, even when I couldn't articulate it." He gestured toward the documentation spread across the table. "This isn't about destroying you, Mother. It's about ending a pattern that has damaged everyone it touched." Eleanor's carefully composed facade began to crumble visibly now, her legendary control slipping away like sand through fingers. "You have no idea what I sacrificed to build this family's position. The compromises, the battles fought in boardrooms, where women weren't welcome. Every advantage you've enjoyed came from my efforts." "We acknowledge your business accomplishments," I interjected, keeping my voice even. "The settlement offers financial security and dignity in retirement. What it doesn't offer is continued control." Davidson cleared his throat, the veteran CEO, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding in what should have been a straightforward corporate meeting. "Eleanor, speaking as someone who has witnessed your leadership for 2 decades, I strongly advise accepting the settlement. The alternative would benefit no one." Eleanor's phone buzzed insistently on the conference table, the screen illuminating with her attorney's name. She reached for it, a reflexive movement toward her typical response to crisis: deployment of legal resources. "Your attorney has already been briefed," Vivian informed her calmly. "Jerome is currently reviewing the evidence with his partners. He recommended you consider the settlement offer without delay." This revelation, that even her trusted legal advisor had effectively abandoned her position, seemed to finally penetrate Eleanor's defenses. For a moment, genuine shock registered on her face, quickly masked but unmistakable. She had built a world where her authority was absolute, her connections impeccable, her control unquestioned. In less than an hour, that world had collapsed around her. "I see," she said softly, an uncharacteristic defeat coloring her voice. "You've been quite thorough." "We had to be," Richard replied. "You taught me that lesson. Leave no detail unaddressed, no contingency unplanned." A bitter smile flickered across Eleanor's face. "Using my own methods against me. Perhaps there's more of me in you than I realized." "The difference," I interjected, "is that we're using these methods to end a cycle of control, not perpetuate it." Eleanor's gaze shifted to the window, watching the storm lash against the glass. The pathetic fallacy wasn't lost on any of us. Nature's fury providing the perfect backdrop to this human tempest. When she turned back, something had changed in her expression. The calculating operator had given way to something rawer, more primal. Wounded pride mixed with a dawning realization of inevitability. "You think you've won," she said, her voice low and intense. "That this carefully orchestrated ambush represents some kind of justice." She leaned forward, addressing me directly. "But you have no idea what it takes to maintain a family legacy. The decisions required, the sacrifices demanded. You're an architect. You build structures. I built dynasties." "What you built," I replied, steadily, "was a prison disguised as privilege. Edward saw it clearly enough to create this trust specifically to break your control. Richard has spent his adult life navigating the emotional manipulation that came with your financial authority. Whatever dynasty you believe you created, it was built on coercion, not consent." Eleanor flinched visibly at this assessment, the truth of it apparently landing with unexpected force. She turned to Walter, seeking a final potential ally in her late husband's attorney. "Walter, you served this family for 30 years. Surely, you can't support this coup." Walter adjusted his glasses, discomfort evident in his posture but resolve clear in his voice. "I serve the Harrington family interests as defined by my client. For decades, that client was Edward. He established this trust with explicit instructions and clear intent. I am simply fulfilling my professional obligation to honor those wishes." The last potential escape route closed, Eleanor sat back in her chair, the weight of her situation visibly settling on her shoulders. The board members exchanged glances, clearly processing the seismic shift in Harrington power dynamics they were witnessing. Janet Murray watched with quiet satisfaction, years of subordination finally balanced by this moment of accountability. With deliberate movements that betrayed none of the emotion surely raging within her, Eleanor lifted her pen and signed the settlement agreement. The scratch of the fountain pen against paper seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed conference room, each stroke formalizing the end of her unchallenged authority. "It's done," she said, sliding the document toward Vivian. "I assume you have a prepared statement for the press. Some sanitized version of events that preserves the Harrington public image while excising me from the narrative? The public announcement will simply state that you're retiring to focus on personal interests," Richard confirmed. "Your legacy as a pioneering female business leader will remain intact. This," he gestured to the evidence spread across the table, "remains private, contingent on your compliance with the settlement terms." Eleanor gathered her belongings with precise movements, her aristocratic bearing reasserting itself as she prepared to exit the room that had witnessed her downfall. "And my personal effects at the estate will be packed and delivered to the address of your choosing," I replied, "along with any legitimately personal items from your office." She stood, smoothing her perfectly tailored suit with habitual elegance. "I suppose I should congratulate you, Alexandra. Few opponents have outmaneuvered me so completely." Her tone carried grudging professional respect beneath the obvious bitterness. "Though I wonder if you realize what you've inherited along with the financial control. The Harrington legacy comes with expectations, obligations, enemies." "I'm aware," I answered simply. "The difference is that our daughter will inherit choices, not conditions. Financial security without emotional coercion, privilege with accountability." For a moment, something flashed in Eleanor's eyes. Perhaps recognition or regret, or simply the final realization that her reign was truly over. Then the mask descended once more, the society matriarch reasserting control over whatever vulnerability might have momentarily surfaced. "Richard," she acknowledged with a slight nod to her son. Then, without further comment, Eleanor Harrington walked out of the conference room, her perfect posture revealing nothing of the catastrophic collapse of power she had just experienced. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow carried more finality than a slam would have. In her wake, the tension in the room shifted perceptibly, the charged atmosphere of confrontation giving way to the more practical energy of transition and implementation. "Well," Davidson said after a moment of silence, "that was unprecedented." He turned to Richard and me with new respect. "What happens now?" "Now," Richard replied, opening the restructuring plan we had prepared, "we begin rebuilding Harrington Enterprises on a foundation of transparency and ethical governance, starting with a complete audit of all operations." As the board members gathered around to review our proposed changes, I stepped momentarily to the window, watching Eleanor's distinctive figure emerge from the building below. Even in defeat, she moved with characteristic grace, her head high as she entered the waiting town car. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the storm-washed streets of Boston, a visual metaphor for her exit from the center of Harrington power to its periphery. The storm outside was beginning to abate, patches of blue sky appearing between dark clouds. Another fitting symbol for the moment. The worst had passed, though the cleanup would require significant effort. I turned back to the conference table where the future of Harrington Enterprises was already taking shape, under new leadership. Eleanor's collapse had been complete, but she had been right about one thing. What we had inherited was complex and demanding. The responsibility of managing the Harrington fortune ethically, of rebuilding corporate culture after decades of Eleanor's influence of establishing a legacy our daughter could one day accept or reject freely, these challenges lay ahead. But unlike Eleanor, we would face them together, as true partners rather than controller and controlled. The cycle was broken. The trust had served its purpose. 1 year to the day after Evelyn's birth, we held a small gathering in the garden of our Beacon Hill townhouse. The space had been transformed from Eleanor's formal entertaining venue to a welcoming family retreat, with comfortable seating areas, native plantings, and a small play space already prepared for when Evelyn would be old enough to use it. My father flew in from Arizona, bringing handcrafted wooden toys he'd made for his granddaughter. Sophia arrived early to help with preparations, her easy laugh filling the kitchen as we arranged platters of food from local vendors rather than the formal catering Eleanor would have insisted upon. Janet Murray attended as a friend rather than staff, her retirement now genuine and fulfilling. Walter Pennington brought his wife, a woman Eleanor had systematically excluded from Harrington events for decades after a perceived social slight. The celebration was deliberately modest, a gathering of people who had supported us through the challenging transition of the past year, rather than the society showcase Eleanor would have orchestrated. No photographers other than our personal ones, no strategic invitations designed to maintain or elevate social position, no performance of wealth intended to intimidate or impress. Evelyn, now taking her first tentative steps with Richard's careful support, moved from guest to guest with the sociable curiosity of a child who had never known the weight of excessive expectations. Her laugh, spontaneous and unreserved, represented everything we had fought to protect. The freedom to develop naturally, without the constraints of performative perfection Eleanor would have imposed. As evening approached, Richard called for everyone's attention, raising a glass in a simple toast. "To family," he said, "chosen and born. To freedom from patterns that no longer serve us. And to Evelyn, may she always know she is loved for who she is, not for what she represents." The gathering continued as twilight softened the garden's edges, conversation flowing naturally without the rigid social choreography that had characterized Harrington events under Eleanor's direction. I moved among our guests, simultaneously host and observer of this new type of family celebration, one defined by genuine connection rather than strategic social positioning. Later, after guests had departed and Evelyn slept peacefully in her nursery, Richard and I sat in the garden enjoying the quiet aftermath. The transformation of our lives over the past year seemed reflected in the space around us, the formal structure still visible but softened, made more welcoming, adapted, to nurture rather than impress. "I found this today," Richard said, producing a small velvet box from his pocket. "In the last of Mother's things from the estate study. Inside was a delicate pearl bracelet, the traditional first birthday gift for Harrington daughters, presented with elaborate ceremony to initiate them into the expectations of family tradition. Eleanor had undoubtedly planned an ostentatious event around this presentation, another opportunity to assert her authority over the next generation. "What do you want to do with it?" I asked, touching the lustrous pearls that represented a legacy of both privilege and constraint. Richard considered the bracelet thoughtfully. "Transform it, I think. Like everything else." We decided that night to have the pearls restrung into a new design, maintaining their intrinsic value while breaking the rigid pattern they had been forced into. The redesigned piece would be saved for Evelyn's 21st birthday, accompanied by the full story of her grandmother, her grandfather's protective foresight, and the choice we had made to transform tradition rather than simply reject or perpetuate. This approach had characterized our entire management of the Harrington legacy over the past year. Not wholesale demolition of inherited structures, but thoughtful conservation that preserved value while removing harmful elements. The family businesses continued, but with transparent governance and ethical practices. The philanthropic work expanded, but with genuine focus on impact rather than influence building. The social connections remained, but based on authentic relationships rather than strategic positioning. My professional identity had undergone similar transformation. The Brownstone Project had launched my reputation as a leading architectural conservationist, resulting in commissions for historically significant properties throughout New England. I had established my own firm, intentionally modest in size but respected for its integrity and expertise. The Harrington connection neither hindered nor defined my work. It had become simply one aspect of a multifaceted identity I had reclaimed from Eleanor's attempted erasure. As we sat in our transformed garden, watching fireflies emerge in the summer twilight, the completion of our journey felt palpable. The desperate investigation launched from a hospital bed while cradling newborn Evelyn had led through confrontation and revelation to this moment of genuine peace. The trust Edward had established had served its purpose, not just transferring financial control, but breaking a generational pattern of manipulation and control. Eleanor's attempt to empty my accounts while I was in labor, her calculated strike, at my most vulnerable moment, had indeed changed everything, just not in the way she had intended. Rather than rendering me dependent on her approval and support, her actions had triggered a sequence of revelations that ultimately freed not just me, but the entire Harrington legacy from patterns of control disguised as care. The transformation was complete. Not through dramatic public exposure or vengeful punishment, but through the more sustainable approach of methodical, principled reform. The same approach I had applied to historical buildings in need of conservation, identifying structural damage, implementing necessary repairs, adapting for contemporary needs, while respecting intrinsic value. Evelyn would grow up in a family transformed, where wealth was managed as a responsibility rather than wielded as a weapon, where traditions served connection rather than control, where her individual development would be nurtured rather than prescribed. The ultimate justice served was not Eleanor's downfall, but the liberation of future generations from patterns that had constrained too many lives for too long. As night fell fully on our garden, stars appearing in the clear summer sky, Richard and I shared a moment of quiet acknowledgement. The Harrington legacy continued but transformed, the cycle broken. The architecture of a family redesigned to shelter and support, not confine and control. The irony remained perfect in its completeness. In attempting to empty my accounts while I was bringing new life into the world, Eleanor had triggered the trust that gave me control of every account she valued. Her desperate grasp for control had resulted in its permanent loss. Her attempt to render me dependent had instead ensured independence for generations to come. The transformation was complete, and it was beautiful in its justice.